Hi, I'm Hobbs, and I'm going to talk with you today about persuasion, how it is that you can be a more persuasive person. And to do that, we're going to go through three basic topics. We're going to talk about what persuasion is, how it works, a little bit about resistance, how it is that people prevent themselves from being changed, and finally some tactics, tips, and tricks, ways that you can be more persuasive and avoid persuasion if someone's using it against you. I read a book the other day about sales. And one of the things that the author said, his name's Birchjoff, he said that anything can be yours if you can persuade the world to give it to you. I thought that was a really interesting take on the power of persuasion in the world we live in. It's useful in finding jobs and any number of things. Anyways, so let's get right to what we're going to be talking about today. First off, what is persuasion? Persuasion is simply trying to create voluntary change. Now that means you're not holding a gun to someone's head, it's just the simple fact that you want them to change an attitude or behavior. The simplest way to think about this is if you think about sort of a tug of war. And on one hand, you have persuasion. Now persuasion pulls the person towards change. The thing that is pulling the other direction is resistance. This can be inside of a person or external, and that's pulling the other way, trying to keep them the same. And these two are in tension, working back and forth, and your job as a persuader is to manage to get the person to change their attitudes or actions. So we're going to talk a little bit about resistance now that you have a basic definition of what persuasion is. Because overcoming resistance is the key to effective persuasion. Now there are four kinds of resistance that you'll run into in life, and each of these four has a few aspects, three of them to be precise. So let's go through the four different kinds of change. We have reactance, we have distrust, we have scrutiny, and we have inertia. Each of these is made up of three elements. An affective element, that is the heart, your emotions, a cognitive element, that's your mind, and finally a motivational element, and that's your actions, your behaviors. So I'm going to go through each of the four kinds that I mentioned earlier. The first one we're going to talk about is reactance. Now reactance occurs when there is a perceived threat to someone's freedom. They feel like something they have a right to is being infringed upon. And the classic example of this is the surly teenager. Now a parent tries to get the teenager to go to bed on time, to do their homework, to not hang out with this particular crowd. Maybe it's not to do drugs or some other harmful behavior. And the harder the parent pushes, the harder there's this persuasive pull, the more the teenager resists and prevents themselves from changing. And often reactance shows itself by seeking the forbidden fruit. They feel that their rights are being infringed upon, and the way they reclaim those rights is by seeking the thing they know they've been told not to do. Reactance has two of the three elements I mentioned. There's an affective element, that is the heart. They don't like the way you make them feel when you try and persuade them. And a motivational, their actions. They won't do whatever it is you're asking them to do. In fact, they'll do the opposite. Second kind of resistance you're going to find is distrust. Distrust is when you're not sure of someone's motivations. You have to sort of ask yourself the question, you get this feeling inside and you ask, why do you want me to change? What's in this for you? What are you trying to get out of me changing? And that also has two elements, different ones. Affective, just like reactance. So there's an emotional feeling of, I don't like the way you make me feel. And then there's the cognitive, I don't believe you. You say you're working in my best interest and I don't believe you anymore because of this feeling that I have. Third kind is scrutiny, and this is by far the most positive kind of resistance that you're going to find. Scrutiny is when the person who is being persuaded starts to look at the pros and cons. They weigh the strengths. They say, is this really a strength? What about this little flaw in it? Does that make it not true anymore? And they also look at the weaknesses, and they say, is this really a weakness? Why would this be true? How does that have an effect on your argument? We want everyone on earth in an ideal place to be scrutinizing the arguments that they're presented with in advertising, from politicians, from their parents, from clergy, everywhere, looking to find the truth, hungering to see what the actual argument is and whether or not it's the right thing to do. This is all cognitive. It's all your mind working to discover the truth. Fourth kind of resistance is inertia. This is by far the most primal and the hardest to overcome. It's simply a desire to not change. the peace of staying right where you're at. An easy way to think about this is a ship with an anchor down. Now the winds of change metaphorically blow on the ship, trying to get it to move along, and the anchor just drags into the bottom of the ocean. There's nothing really working there except this stuckness, this feeling that I won't change no matter what happens. A classic example of that would be the old codger, the old man who is set in his ways and has no plans of changing, no matter what truth he's presented with. Now that you know these 4 kinds of resistance, hopefully just recognizing them will make it easier for you to overcome them. And we're going to get into some tips and tricks, strategies you can use when you're persuading someone. I'm going to preach at you for just a second, get up on my soapbox, and say if you are going to persuade someone, you need to be very sure that what you're persuading them of is in their best interest. Persuade people for the right reasons. We don't need any more con men in the world. Alright, so some tactics here. Alpha tactics and omega tactics are the first 2 we're going to talk about. Now an alpha tactic is when you take the persuasive element and you pull harder. That can be sweetening the deal. That can be telling someone, listen, you buy this and I'll go ahead and I will throw in a free toaster. It can also be something like, well, I made this argument, what about these 3 arguments that I hadn't mentioned? Or saying, listen, this scientific report backs up what it is that I am telling you. You're pulling harder with the persuasion. And this is usually what people do. But something most people don't do, and it's much, much more effective, studies have shown, is omega tactics. And the omega tactic is the opposite approach. Instead of pulling harder, you come over here to the resistance and you say, why are you resisting? What is it that is preventing you from changing? And you remove that resistance. And suddenly the person is free to move in the direction that you want them to go. The classic story of an omega tactic is in the book of Genesis. It's the story of Eve and the serpent, and we all know it. The serpent comes to Eve to tempt her, and she says, no, God has told us that if we eat of the apple, we will die. Now her resistance is the fear of death. And the serpent doesn't say, listen, you eat the apple and I will throw in 5 brand new suits, or I'll throw in your own garden just to yourself. He doesn't say, I know way more than God does about this. Don't worry about that. I'm a more credible source. What he does is he goes to the resistance and he says, you will not surely die. He removes the thing that is preventing her from changing. Please, I'm not encouraging you to be like the devil. I'm encouraging you to use these tactics for good. If you find that someone is preventing change, find what that resistance is from and remove it, and they're much more likely to move forward. Next thing we're going to look at is called looking ahead. This one is quite simple. All you ask a person to do is think about the long-term consequences of their choice. Now a lot of times in the moment when someone wants you to change, especially if they're using alpha tactics, if they're pulling really hard, you get this feeling, this inertia that you don't want to move. You feel that it's inconvenient and it's going to be troublesome. So asking someone to look in the future points them to the good consequences of their action that should occur if they follow your advice. This is a very effective way of getting someone out of the resistance of the moment and into the positive future. This is something I use on myself quite a bit. I know that sounds odd, but I'll explain it. I often feel like I want to sing, especially in public, and especially worship songs. That's sort of something I enjoy doing. And a lot of times I'll be on a bus or walking down a sidewalk and I will want to sing, and I love to sing loud, but I don't do it because I'm afraid of what people will think of me. So I started asking myself a question. I started asking, what would I lose if I did this thing? What could I possibly lose? And for me, the answer was nothing. Maybe the respect of some people that I will never see again. That's all that I have at stake here. So I should change. Looking into the future, looking ahead, gave me the courage to do the thing that I otherwise would have resisted doing. I'm going to give you a little pointer tip here, something very small. But if you ever get someone to say for themselves what it is that they should do, it is 10 times more effective than telling them. People are always more willing to believe the words that come out of their own mouths rather than you telling them something. Alright, so that's just a small pointer. And move on to my final tactic before I close here, and that is the use of stories. Simply put, stories change lives. Stories are everywhere. Pastors use illustrations. Presidents bring out letters that people, their constituents, have written to them. It's in advertisements. It's in the media. It's all the movies we watch. It's all the books we read. Stories are constantly bombarding us because stories are such a simple way to get at our hearts and past our walls, past those things that make us want to resist. The classic example of this, and by far the oldest, is the cave drawing. Think about it. The very first proof we have of humanity's existence is the fact that some man or woman took the time to draw a story on the wall of his home. So stories are very good at affecting change. And they're specifically good at reaching people who otherwise would have resisted what it was you wanted them to do. When you're expecting a lot of resistance, don't use alpha tactics. Don't keep pushing and pushing and pushing. Try and go around the resistance and go straight to the heart and say, listen, let me tell you a story. Let me tell you why you should change because of what happened to this person who didn't change, or some other more subtle technique. Listen, that is all the time I have for today, but I would love if you enjoyed this, if you thought it would be helpful for you, if you think it would be helpful for your wife, for your kids, share this video. Tell someone about it. Make them better persuaders, and make them realize if someone comes along who's trying to persuade them for something that isn't good, how it is that person will work, what things they will try and do. Next week, I'm going to be doing this for the next 4 weeks, once a week. Next week, we're going to look at the media and how it is that stories in the news can be twisted and manipulated in simple ways, simple changes of words and phrases that make you misinterpret the truth, ways that they can frame the truth to make you believe what they want you to believe, consciously or unconsciously. I hope you enjoyed this. Go out there, fight for the truth, and I will see you next week.